You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, my name is Osman Butt. Welcome to MEMO Conversations. My guest today is Charles Al Hayek. He lives and works in Beirut, Lebanon, is a history instructor and cultural heritage consultant. He founded Heritage and Roots, a social media platform that posts Lebanese, Arab history and cultural heritage content in engaging and enticing ways. For the past 20 years, he has been teaching and working on projects that aim to reconnect citizens to their history and heritage in Lebanon. Al Hayek was a resident writer at the Center for Arts and Humanities, American University of Beirut, AUB, between 2020 to 2021, where he worked on writing and producing a series of short documentaries, Lebanon Centenary, 100 Years Fact and Fiction. Al Hayek is currently doing an MA in Arab and Middle Eastern History at the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, AUB. Charles, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you, Usman. I'm happy to be on MEMO Conversations.
Yes, and it's a great pleasure for us to have you because your content is, it's interesting because when we sort of think about the uses of things like Instagram and social media, we tend to think of it being used for, aesthetic reasons. We use it for entertainment, we use it for weird videos and so on. But you're trying to engage with history, which is a subject as far removed from social media as we can find it. So could you perhaps tell us what drew you to exploring Lebanon's past and producing online content for a wider audience to explore with you?
So the concept behind this would be what we call edutainment. So I said to myself after, I've been teaching since I was 19. And given that during COVID, we were trapped in our homes, I said to myself, why don't I use social media, that is one of the most engaging platforms, to actually share more insights on our history and cultural heritage. Given that Lebanon, one of the dimensions of the crisis of Lebanon is kind of ignorance, a public ignorance of what Lebanese history is and what Lebanese cultural heritage is. So I said to myself, let me give it a shot. It started out of some sort of an accident. I was biking along the coastal way next to the historical city of Byblos, and then my bike broke next to a Crusaders tower. And I said to myself, while waiting for my brother-in-law to come and pick me up, let me do a short video on the history of this tower. And also I added another layer, because tower in Arabic is Burj, and we have many cities and towns in Lebanon that are named Burj of. So I explained that and people liked it. Gradually, I started making what we call Instagram lives, and engagement was very high. And this is when I took the decision, this is the time to actually dedicate my Instagram page to Lebanese and Middle Eastern and Arab history. I believe there's a lack of proper cultural content on social media, especially in the Middle East and MENA region. So I'm trying on a very modest scale to put forward content that might help students study, people get inspired, and people understand and engage with their history.
So could you actually quickly explain, since you mentioned that there's only places called Burj, what is it with Lebanon's fascination with using the word tower and everything?
Well, this goes back to the Mamluk period. When the Mamluks defeated the Crusaders, the last Crusaders retreated to Cyprus. But they engage often in maritime expeditions, attacking the coastal areas of Lebanon. So the Mamluks devised a defensive system. They constructed towers along the coast, watchtowers, so they can easily relay the news on the coast of a Crusader maritime invasion. In some areas, whole towns grew around the towers. The towers disappeared, but the names are survived.
Well, it's really interesting what survives and what doesn't in terms of names. But this sort of leads a little bit into my next question. Could you perhaps expand further on the state of history, memory, as well as heritage in Lebanon today?
As you know, Lebanon is a country that it's a historical land, but a rather young nation. We are officially 102 years old. We were born from the dismantlement of the Ottoman Empire and the mandate systems between 1918 and 1920. History was used first in the 20s to justify the creation of a nation of Lebanon. We were heavily influenced by the concept of French nationalism and how the French actually use extensively history to justify la construction nationale, the construction of a nation. But this history in Lebanon is controversial and conflictual because basically you have within this history three conflicting dynamics and three conflicting paths of history. You have the mainstream official narrative, which is very politically correct. No one gets offended here. You have the narrative where Lebanon is a modern day Phoenicia, a modern day resurrection of a Phoenician, more Mediterranean, more European. And you have the undertone message that this is a Christian country and other non-Christian Lebanese are not as Lebanese as the Christian Lebanese. And you have the third narrative, which is the Arab narrative. Lebanon is an Arab country. Everyone here is Arab. He is more connected to the Middle East. Lebanon was historically part of some sort of Syria, even if neither Lebanon or Syria existed as modern day countries before the 20th century. So the three conflict in every sense in how Lebanese conceive who they are. And sometimes the debates are really heated. You add to that the collective memories. As you know, collective memory and history are sometimes can easily be opponents. History is supposed to be rational, scientific. Collective memory is more emotional. You choose what to remember or what to forget. And given that Lebanon has had a very violent recent past, especially the civil war, the collective memories of the different factions are conflictual. And they are still heavily present in the political discourse, and they influence political choice and political affiliation. Three, cultural heritage in Lebanon, well, as any country that has experienced long period of conflict, is in a horrible condition in terms of preservation. It is a cultural heritage that is endangered by lack of funds, endangered by pillaging, and endangered sometimes by the creation of fake heritage because of this disconnection that happened during the war of what is Lebanese cultural heritage in terms of music, dance, architecture, culinary heritage. People, because it's not their fault, because there was no proper assessment and preservation of Lebanese tangible and intangible heritage, tend to create what seems to be heritage but is not Lebanese heritage, especially now in the period, in the post-conflict period.
It's interesting, as you're saying that, to construct a non-offensive history, and one of the first things you said. But I suppose my question is, because in that in of itself would be a kind of achievement in a way. But I'm wondering then, so who's actually deciding what this history is?
Well, you have, let's say, you had three big periods of coining and writing Lebanese history. The first was under French mandate. They were mainly French missionaries or Lebanese elite francophone from Beirut and Mount Lebanon who articulated Lebanese history to justify the creation of the modern state of Lebanon. And especially, if you're familiar with our recent history, in the 19th century, Mount Lebanon was a semi-autonomous Ottoman province, but it was only the mountain. One of the main demands of the early Lebanese nationalists was to expand this mountain and to add Beirut, what is now the north, the south, and the Bekaa, the rich agricultural plains. So this entire history was waved around justifying the expansion of this mountainous enclave and its independence from Syria, even if it was never part of Syria in terms of modern country. So this was mainly done by French, under French influence. Then you have in the can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. Then you have in the 60s, 70s, because Lebanon had some sort of stability, there was a wide expansion of public schools. And there was some work on a curriculum to try to find historical antecedents of Lebanon. This is when the figure of Fakhruddin as the founding father of Lebanon becomes very important, especially under President Fuad Shahab, 1958, 1964, who was trying to echo himself as a new Fakhruddin. Fakhruddin is a key element, key figure in Lebanese history, especially in art in this period. There was a lot of theater play inspired by history. I think it's very intelligent because this was some sort of early public history to educate a wider public on their history. And then you have the period in the 80s and post-80s, especially by the big names of AUB, like the late Professor Kamal Salibi, or the late Professor Abdurrahim Abu Hussein, or Marwan Bahiri, who questioned this narrative and went back to studying the sources and the elements of this narrative and proved that much of this narrative was fiction and not factual history. Problem is, Usman, that up until today, the official curriculum in Lebanon is unified, even though there are these narratives that we have different historical books. No, we have one history book, one official history content in all the schools, but the methods of teaching it and the perspectives are completely different. The method is rather archaic. Its students are invited to memorize historical data, mainly political context, nothing social, nothing cultural heritage, nothing economic, and to go to the national examination and answer in quasi-robotic. And the different perspectives, and this is where you have this dangerous interpretations sometimes, that dangerous in terms of what everyone is free to have his own perspective on history, but dangerous when they generate some sort of violence and generate violent tensions between the communities who think that they are in conflict for cultural, historical, and religious reasons.
So you've mentioned Fakhruddin. I'm wondering for our audience if you could sort of explain why he's important.
Fakhruddin, we're talking about the Middle East under Ottoman rule, late 16th century, early 17th century. He's a provincial leader. He's a Lebanese provincial leader, an emir, who in the context of the Ottoman system of administration of rural areas becomes what we call the multazim. He who takes in charge three things: collecting taxes, administering justice, and making sure there are no insecurities. But this emir expands actually from his base in Mount Lebanon to control most of what is rural Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, and becomes wealthy and influential and powerful because he was trading silk with the Tuscans. And in times of the price revolution, when the Ottoman Empire was experiencing severe inflation, his province was actually attracting gold instead of sending gold away from the empire. The Ottomans considered him to be a threat, tried twice to first contain him and second destroyed and killed him. In the Lebanese narrative, he is considered as the founding father of Lebanon. Historically, this is wrong for a simple reason. He never conceived of himself as a Lebanese prince. But the social dynamics under his rule between the two key historical communities of what is modern Lebanon, the Maronites and the Druze, took another dimension. They worked together to ensure this tradition of self-rule. And this idea would later develop in the late 19th century into Lebanese nationalism. So symbolically, yes, we might consider him as the founding father of Lebanon, but historically, he's not. He's a very important provincial leader who gave the Ottomans a hard time.
Yes, and in Lebanon as well, as you were also mentioning, you have this idea that we're sort of Arab, but we're kind of not. We're Phoenician, which is tying it back to Europe effectively. But it's only some communities that seem to adopt that as a narrative.
Of course, it's mostly class rather than communities, because you find this Phoenician narrative, especially in mostly elite traders on the coast, whether Christian or Muslim. Of course, Lebanon was part of what was historical Phoenicia, but Phoenicia was never a modern nation in the modern sense. There was no country called Phoenicia. There was a series of 4 main Phoenician city-state kingdoms: Arwad in Syria, Byblos, Saida, and Sur in Lebanon. In the late 19th century, some of the extremely wealthy traders of Beirut wanted to justify the role of their city, and saw in the prosperity of late 19th century Beirut an echo of Phoenician city-state and Phoenician Mediterranean trade. This was used as an argument in 1919 in the peace conference to justify the expansion of Lebanon. Now it is coming back because of the lack of attachment to the narrative of Arab belonging, especially that this Arab identity was linked with the different pan-Arab regimes who exerted influence in Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and sometimes this influence is perceived by the Lebanese, was and is still perceived as actually a negative influence that contributed to the instability in Lebanon. So this is why it's a way of escaping the Arab identity, escaping also this narrative that Lebanon was part of Syria, and saying that, listen, we are Phoenicians, we are closer to Europeans than the Arabs.
Yes, it's really interesting that we see that type of narrative taking off in different parts of the Middle East as well, where different groups imagine themselves closer to Europe than whatever region they happen to be in. But also, when you're dealing with Lebanese history, as you mentioned, you're also dealing with a lot of personal collective memories in addition to all of that. And I'm sort of wondering, history is serious business in Lebanon. Despite the fact that no one agrees on what exactly it is. And so I'm wondering, how do you sort of, deal with the fact that there are these different narratives, different communities, and different individuals who, for them, history is a very personal thing. How do you sort of deal with all of those conflicts, explore it in a fun way as well?
Well, most of my content would be about cultural heritage rather than, of course, there is proper historical content. And whenever this content is shared, sometimes the discussions are very heated. Because the problem is, given that these narratives are sometimes sanctified, putting them in the prospect and the perspective of questioning is something that calls for anger, calls for reaction, and this is perfectly normal. But what I try to do is go to simple factual history and explain that one of the aims of history is to deconstruct events to their basic components and try to see for each component if that corresponds to this proper historical, economic, social, political, even climatic. It is still heated. We are still a long way from agreeing. We don't need to agree, but we need to accept that there is another historical narrative that is out there. But usually what I try to promote is that our cultural heritage is shared. even though we are a country that is extremely diverse, given its little surface. We have 18 different religious communities. But these 18 different religious communities share, have a shared cultural heritage, the same food, same music, the same way of dealing with happiness and sadness, the same way, the same social structure. So let's put forward this shared cultural heritage, try to preserve it, and discuss the different narratives that we have on history without transforming them into sources of tension and violence, and without using them as factors of polarization in an extremely polarized political situation.
Yes, because that's obviously a very important point, that there is a lot of polarization in Lebanon. But sort of thinking about this as well, because we've obviously got younger generations in Lebanon now, and they're obviously one of the key people interacting with your work. So I'm sort of wondering, what is it that they're curious about? What is it they are interested in? What is it they react to when you do? What is the difference between them and older generations?
Well, this is something that I have been monitoring. That the engagement is very high from the younger generation, because this is a generation that didn't live the Civil War and didn't really have any proper historical education, neither at school or in their houses. So they are very interested in everything that relates to identity. Who are we? The basic questions. Who are we? Who are our friends? Who are our enemies? They are very interested in content that is related to culinary heritage, because I try to explain our history using food. They are very interested in discovering the different monuments in Lebanon, because many didn't really go and explore the country, even if it is a very small country. Some Lebanese, because they inherited the psychological barriers from the Civil War, from their parents, have issues crossing to area of a different religious affiliation. So by going there, but by showing them the history, sometimes the very fun and funny history of a monument, of a figure, of a dish, I often receive messages telling me that we went there. We went to the monument you showed in one of your episodes, and we discovered this kind of special food, and we went and asked for this particular historical figure. So the older generation some are very skeptical, because some of them actually believe that this official narrative is historical fact, is based on historical fact. But what is humbling is when I get messages from really senior citizens telling me about, when I share about a tradition or heritage, that this is the way they used to do it. They sometimes send me their photos from the 50s and the 40s, and this is humbling, because they see in it efforts to preserve this. So in a nutshell, it will be identity, it will be culinary heritage, and it will be a tangible cultural heritage in terms of monuments and natural heritage. That is, and also the episodes when I speak about the political roots of the Lebanese idea. Well, this gets the highest engagement.
But so that's kind of what they're interested in. But can you detect what kind of ideas about the past they're developing?
Of course. So first, there is some difficulty in understanding that past is all about continuity, but also change. So when we explain, I'll give you an example, because many Lebanese do identify as Phoenicians or as Arabs and purely Phoenicians. When I try to see that we cannot single out one identity in such a long history and claim that it did not change through the centuries, this sometimes creates tension, because the concept of change is not very clear in their perspective of history. Other things would be, so this is one of the perspective, that history in Lebanon didn't really change because they insert the element of resistance, that because it is a mountainous region, it's a refuge for persecuted communities, and these persecuted communities preserved their identity untouched throughout the centuries. The second would be pure curiosity, as simple as that. Curiosity to go and discover the historical sites and historical period. The third would be what I call instant reaction, and then no more reaction. So, which is normal on social media.
So, but because I'm also thinking about the fact that Lebanon is, whenever it's obviously reported, it's a country that's always going from crisis to crisis. And I'm sort of wondering in terms of whether that impacts the way you sort of try to tell some history, because a lot of people I'd imagine would be interested in how did we get to where we are?
Of course. This is also a question. First, we haven't always been such a country in such a mess. Between 1940 and 1970, we kind of had 30 years of relative stability. And in these 30 years of relative stability, we have managed to construct a modern, kind of a modern state. We have effectively fought analphabetism. We rose from 40% to 80%, and some figures also are higher. We were the only Arab country that had an expanding middle class, and we were the cultural hub of the Middle East, creating and coining artistic and cultural notions that are still key and central to Arab modernity. So we need to keep that in mind. But also, this was a country of severe social inequalities, of bad economic planning, and we had the misfortune of having rather violent neighbors, the Israeli occupation in Palestine and the Syrian regime. And we also had thousands of armed Palestinians with thousands of armed Lebanese militiamen fighting them. So I try to put things into proper historical context, because there is some sort of fatalism now in dealing with Lebanese history, that Lebanon's fate has always been that of a country in crisis. No, we have been going through a very particular conjuncture of events that produced this, but we also were able to produce a counter crisis, a period of progress. So this is what I try to say.
Yes, that's very important. But I'm also wondering, because I was looking through some interviews you gave, and you spoke about things like the Lebanese famine in 1915 and 1916, and you've spoken about other issues. And it seems like there's not much, there doesn't seem to be much dealing with these issues. So I'm sort of wondering, is there like episodes in Lebanese history that the Lebanese, at least officially, are trying to forget?
Well, it's not about trying to forget, it's about how to use this event in history. So I will take two events and put them into how Lebanese deal with them: the famine and the civil war. The famine happened, of course. It was a horrible, horrible period of hardship. But we don't have enough scholarship on the famine to understand it. We now know that this was not orchestrated by the Ottomans to destroy the Christian communities of Lebanon. Because first, every community suffered, and a quarter of the population died. There was a conjuncture of Ottoman irresponsibility, French and British maritime blockade, local hoarding, and bad crops for 9 years before the famine. But in the 1920s, the emerging Lebanese historiography needed the quintessential enemy of the Lebanese to justify the creation of Lebanon and to put the Lebanese in the perspective of a long national fight for freedom. And this is given that the last 10 years of Ottoman rule were full of hardship and horrors. They were singled out as the quintessential enemy of the Lebanese, and the famine is the quintessential expression of this Ottoman barbarism. So it was used as a factor to justify Lebanon. So this is why whenever you go and you put things into another perspective, it becomes controversial. The civil war, well, the Lebanese state adopted an official amnesia to everything that is related to civil war, and then developed the narrative and even actually paid intellectuals to produce this narrative, very well written. This is the war of others on the Lebanese soil, as if the Lebanese have no responsibility in the civil war. So by pushing forward this narrative, you are actually de-rationalizing the history of the civil war, and you are pushing it into oblivion. Nothing happened. We are not to blame. The only ones to blame are the strangers, and let's go back to business as usual.
Yes, yes. And so from looking at all the different histories that you've researched, has there been anything that sort of surprised you in an interesting way, something you didn't know and you thought, wow?
Well, recently, speaking about Fakhruddin, I'm recently researching about. There is a prince in the 15th century, a local prince, who wrote the first history book on Beirut, the first book dedicated to the history of Beirut. His name is Salih ibn Yahya, and he wrote Tarikh Beirut. He opens his book by describing the Feast of the River in Beirut as a shared Christian and Muslim feast, celebrating Saint George, who is Al Khudr in Beirut and for the Muslim communities, and with a feast, a kind of imagine an entire city that goes to a picnic next to the river that is in their territory and celebrate their city. While researching that, because me and a bunch of friends are trying to reinstate this feast in Beirut, I find that in one of the historical mosques, there was an inscription that now probably disappeared, an Ottoman Turkish description that is vilifying the Fakhruddin as a traitor to the Ottoman Sultanate. So he gave them such a hard time that even in poetry on the doors of a mosque in Beirut, they wanted to criticize them. But what amazes me is when you go to villages such as Ihdin in the north, and you see that heritage and history are still part of the identity and they don't fake it. When they tell you the founding myth of their town in verse, they sing it, they know it. And for me, this is profoundly heartwarming. Or when you go to Lesa or Af'a, this is the highlands of Byblos, where you have Shia and Maronites who still go and pray in the temple of Astarte. They light candles in the temple and they venerate a lady of Af'a who is equated with the Virgin, but who is actually Astarte, the Phoenician mother god, the Phoenician goddess of fecundity, who survived as the Virgin. This is for me is an amazing. Or last, when you see that in villages where you have Muslims and Christians living together, when Christians wanted their Muslim neighbors to take part in their celebration, and I don't know if you have been to Lebanon, but food is key in Lebanese society. So how do you invite your Muslim friends and neighbors and you're having meat that is not halal? The solution that was found by the Christians is to give the cattle during the feast to the Muslims, so they slaughter it halal and then give them back to the meat so they can cook it and eat it together. So these communities developed a modus vivendi that is worth re-exploring and put forward for a wider public.
Do you get much help from like universities or anyone else involved in history with your work?
From universities, no, because my work, I work as an independent researcher, and even though I decided to go back and be a student at 40 at the AUB, this actually gives me opportunities for research. But no, my work is independent. I do it on my own.
Okay, and so last question, what is the future of history in Lebanon?
That's a very good question, actually. The future of history will definitely be linked to education. We need to renovate, we need to change our historical curriculum. We need to make it more engaging. We need to put forward elements of cultural heritage. We need to make it more appealing to the younger generation. And we need to push them to develop critical thinking while studying history. For now, studying history in Lebanon is vowed to become a course that no student would choose. So either we modernize the approach, we make it more engaging, we put forward digital humanities, cultural heritage, or sadly, this would be one of the most hated courses in high schools and universities.
Charles Al Hayek, thank you for talking to Memo Conversation Live.
Pleasure.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please tune in next week for another Memo Conversations Live.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.